Okay, good morning, everyone. Why don't we go ahead and get started? So today we're going to continue on the train of understanding nature, and we're going to be talking about, as opposed to preserving biodiversity and what biodiversity means, and conservation, we're going to be talking about waste and microplastics. So we're going to talk about how humans and what sort of how we destroy nature and what we do with our waste. And so this is a really important topic. I mean, not like anything we haven't talked about before isn't important, but particularly now, as human populations are still growing and we're producing more and more and more waste, it's really important to sort of understand what happens with your waste and what you can do to make your waste habits a little bit greener. So we're going to start this class off with just a little anecdote. And so for those of you that have never seen this handsome gentleman here, this is the Mad Hatter. And so I preface what I'm going to talk about in a second by just showing you the Mad Hatter. Keep the Mad Hatter in mind. And it'll become clear to you at the end of this little spiel why I'm going to show you the Mad Hatter. So we're going to start off by talking about the curious case of Minamata. And so Minamata is a city located in the Kunamoto Prefecture in Japan. So for those of you that know anything about Japanese geography, it's sort of at the south western part of Japan, sort of near South Korea. And so this is Minamata here, and this has this sort of overall bay in the Yadashiro Sea. In the 1900s, Minamata was an impoverished fishing village, like many coastal areas around the world at that time, and even still in modern times. But in 1908, the Chiso Corporation opened a chemical factory in Minamata, producing at the start fertilizers, but then eventually started branching out into the production of acetaldehyde. And acetaldehyde is a compound used to make primarily plastics, but it's also used to make glue. And this is a sort of important thing, and you'll sort of talk about how dangerous plastics can be later, but precursors to plastics and the way we make plastics is a particularly dangerous process. So I think you can already sort of see that poor village, corporation opening up a chemical factory, probably not going to end up very well. And you would be absolutely correct to do that. So by 1932, so about 24 years or so after opening the factory, the corporation was producing about 210 tons of acetaldehyde per year. By 1951, that production had jumped to well over 6,000 tons per year, and that's a lot of plastic and a lot of plastic components. But one of the sort of things, historically speaking, not so much nowadays, but historically speaking, the way we used to make acetaldehyde and other sort of precursors to what we consider plastic, they typically use mercury. And I'm sure you guys have all heard of mercury in some way, shape, or form. Maybe you've heard about it in your tuna or something like that, right? You've probably heard of mercury in some fashion. Mercury is kind of a cool element. It's liquid at room temperature. You can do cool stuff with it. But mercury is used in the production of this process of making acetaldehyde. And now, one of the things that happens with mercury, because mercury as an elemental form, when it's just sort of regular mercury, bacteria, what they'll do is they'll convert mercury into what's called methyl mercury. And they do this because it's regular mercury is toxic to them, but converting it to methyl mercury makes it slightly less toxic to them, so it's better for them. And this methyl mercury is actually really, really, really toxic. So methyl mercury is organic. It easily absorbs into tissue. It is extremely toxic. So you need very little methyl mercury to kill a human, or even something as small as, say, a fish. So we're using mercury to make plastic, and we're ramping up the production of plastic over time. So I'm sure you can see right away where I'm setting the stage for something very, very bad to happen. And so by 1955, very, very strange things are beginning to happen to local animals. So they were noting that residents were noting that cats began committing suicide. And I mean this as in cats would jump off bridges into water, or like try to run in front of traffic and stuff like that. Cats would, by all appearances, were trying to kill themselves. In addition, they were starting to see dogs disappear. They were seeing birds falling dead from the sky. They were seeing massive fish kills, and fish were being pulled from the coastal area. Because remember, this was a fishing town primarily, and the fish they were pulling out were having all sorts of funky deformities, including multiple heads, multiple tails, missing fins, all sorts of crazy and wacky things. So this is what they were seeing. And you can imagine maybe in 1955, before the sort of invention of sort of modern environmental biology, you can imagine this was something that was probably very scary. And that was something that was sort of very perplexing to these people. I think, we look at this in hindsight and say, oh, yeah, of course it's the mercury, but they didn't really know at the time. And so this was sort of happening in the 50s. And by 1956, a 5-year-old girl was examined at the hospital at the factory. And this 5-year-old girl had difficulty walking, she had difficulty speaking, and she was having convulsions. And the doctors were absolutely puzzled by the symptoms. And after this initial girl, they found 8 other girls found to be experiencing the same problems. And originally they thought this was something contagious. It was some sort of bacterial disease or some viral disease. So they isolated the patients and they named it Minamata disease, thinking it was some brand new pathogen that was affecting the people that were living there. And so this is where we are. We're seeing infection of small children. By April of 1956, so a few months later, they had about 40 patients that were exhibiting symptoms of Minamata disease, and 14 of those patients died. So it had a 10% mortality rate, which is pretty high for, not just for an infectious disease, but it's pretty high for even like a poisoning. So they were seeing some pretty scary things and they didn't know what it was. And so we can ask the question, what's happening? But again, I think this is, given what we know about mercury and given what we know about how poisonings work, I think it's pretty straightforward to understand what's happening here. The production of mercury in these factories was leading to these causes. It was leading to all these sicknesses. So the idea being there was industrial wastewater coming from this factory that was filled with mercury, and this went into the adjacent Minamata Bay. And once it makes it into the bay, well, it gets picked up by things that live in the bay, fish, shellfish, and then even the toxic sludge from the bay, even the sediments from the bay, it gets picked up by that. And you can imagine if you are in a fishing town, you're probably eating a lot of fish. And so if the fish and the shellfish are picking up this mercury and you're eating those fish and shellfish, well, you're picking up that mercury as well. And so when you think about sort of what's going on here, right, it's clearly a case of mercury poisoning. And mercury poisoning, like many types of poisoning, is a pretty nasty way to go. It was about 150 times that of a sort of non-Minamata residence. I just want to sort of say one thing about mercury. I'll come back to talking about mercury in a second, but just one thing about mercury is it is a natural compound, like very many of the poisons. So you can have mercury inside your body, and it won't be that big a deal. It's really about the concentration. So you can see we're getting about 150 times the concentration inside people suffering from Minamata disease versus people that are not suffering from Minamata disease. And so the people that were suffering from this, they have all sorts of nasty symptoms: muscle weakness, damage to hearing, vision, speech, crippling of the hands and feet, paralysis, coma, and death. And it's a pretty severe way to sort of go. As most poisonings with metals are, it's a pretty sort of terrible way to die. And there's pictures here about people suffering from it if you want to make yourself sad. But it is a really sort of tough way to sort of go, unfortunately. Overall, they they recorded approximately 3,000 cases of Minamata disease. Of those 3,000, 1,800 die. So it was a pretty high mortality rate from this mercury poisoning. And they also believe that there was many, many more undiagnosed cases, possibly well over 100,000 people suffering from some sort of degree of mercury poisoning. And this sort of one of the things about poisonings in general is they don't really affect everyone the exact same way. So, someone like me who is a bit larger, would be much less susceptible to mercury poisoning than, say, someone like my wife, who is, significantly smaller than I am. So it does affect people differently, and so, but again, it's still a poisoning. It's still something that does damage to biology. I should also mention that not only does humans and our cats and dogs suffer for it, but it does directly harm the wildlife, fish, shellfish, things like that. So it's sort of an indiscriminate poisoning. So sort of fast forwarding, in the 1970s, we had the water pollution control laws were enacted across not just Japan, but many parts of the world. And what this law does, and what does again in Japan and across the planet, is it enforced the control of the discharge of all water into in relation to toxic substances. So you simply just cannot dump, in most countries, you cannot just simply dump toxic substances into essentially pristine or natural waters. That's just not something you can do anymore. There's pretty sort of steep fines and penalties and jail sentences for it. But it is sort of differentially regulated across the globe, unfortunately. After that sort of Water Control Act, they started to restore Minamata Bay. So they started digging out all the sludge and all the sediment from the bottom of the bay and getting rid of it to essentially remove any potential existing sources within the bay. And they basically, after they sort of started treating the water, they started treating the sediment, they saw that the mercury concentrations were dropping down to a much safer level of about 4 parts per million. So that's Minamata. And so Minamata is an example of mercury poisoning. This is a point source pollution. So it was coming from one specific area. And so there's sort of a dichotomy here. We have what's called a point source solution, which is pollution, where it's coming directly from one source. You know exactly where it's coming from. So you have a pipe that's coming from a factory. I know where my mercury poisoning is coming from. This is in contrast to a non-point source of pollution, which would be something like the Mississippi River, where tons and tons of places are dumping things into the Mississippi River. And if something really toxic made it into the Mississippi River, it would be very, very hard to trace it back to where it came, simply because there's many potential sources. But mercury itself is an example of a hazardous waste. And when we think about a hazardous waste, it's something that poses a threat to human health or the environment because it is poisonous, dangerously chemically reactive, corrosive, or even flammable. And this sort of encompasses a very wide range of things, including industrial solvents, medical waste, batteries, acid or sludge from incinerators, coal, radioactive waste, electronic waste. There's a whole sort of class of things that fall under this idea of hazardous waste. So there's a lot of things that essentially is encompassed by this term hazardous waste. When you think about globally, 80 to 90% of hazardous waste is produced by developed countries, including the United States, the EU, Australia, China. So very, sort of much more advanced countries. In terms of, countries that are poor, they produce less waste overall, less hazardous waste. And so that's Minamata. And so back to our sort of the starting slide. This idea of the Mad Hatter, it comes from, you may have heard of the Mad Hatter. You also may have heard of someone saying you're as mad as a hatter, or maybe you've never heard anyone say that, but that's a term. It's an old colloquial English phrase that describes someone as suffering from insanity. And this came to be because people that used to make hats often use mercury to make them softer. And when you use mercury, as we've seen, if you breathe it in or you get it inside you, it can cause some pretty severe neurological symptoms. And so those that were making hats were suffering from mercury poisoning and essentially displaying some form of level of insanity, which people would call them mad as a hatter. So if you ever wonder where the Mad Hatter comes from Alice in Wonderland or even, a Disney movie, that's where it comes from. All because of a hazardous chemical. So that's Minamata, that's the Mad Hatter. But before we sort of move on, I just want to make one quick note about mercury. It's sort of a foreshadow for what we're going to talk about next week. But mercury itself is a metal. It's liquid at room temperatures. Again, it's kind of a cool element. And it does have varying level of toxicity. So when we think about Minamata, we talked about methylmercury. And this is what methylmercury looks like. It's mercury, Hg, bound to this and then bound to something else. That's the sort of the chemical formula for methylmercury. This is very, 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 very dangerous. Very small amounts of methylmercury is very toxic. That's in contrast to something like ethyl mercury, which is a mercury bound to two of these carbon groups here, bound to something else. This is very, very not toxic. And in fact, it's something we actually use as a preservative, especially historically speaking. So mercury has varying levels of toxicity. Just because there's mercury in something doesn't necessarily mean it's bad, unless it's methyl mercury, and then it's really, really bad. But I say this is sort of a foreshadow to what we're going to talk about next week, because we're going to talk about ethyl mercury next week when we talk about vaccines, because it's a sort of important thing, unfortunately, when we talk about vaccines. So. But how do we get rid of hazardous waste? So we talked about Minamata, we talked about digging up things and stuff like that, but how do we sort of in modern times, how do we handle our waste? And there's sort of three sort of ways we handle waste. Well, there's many ways we handle waste, but some of the common ways we handle waste include bioremediation. So we use bacteria or biological entities such as proteins or enzymes to break down our hazardous substances. We commonly use phytoremediation, basically using plants or algae to remove contaminants from soil or water. And the idea here is phytoremediation. Our plants act as essentially as a pollution sponge, sucking up all sorts of bad things from the environment, keeping them from sort of persisting in the environment. So they essentially sequester pollutions in their tissue, making the environment safer. And finally, we also use what's called plasma gasification, which is probably badass of all the ways to get rid of waste. Though I like bioremediation the best, but I'm also a microbiologist, so I'm a little biased. But plasma gasification is actually using electricity to vaporize trash, which is actually pretty cool. So you can take a sort of a mound of trash and vaporize it into essentially a tiny, tiny pile of ash, and that's safe. If you want to sort of see how this works, there's a nice documentary on Netflix called A Plastic Ocean, and it talks about how the United States Navy is using plasma gasification to treat its waste so it doesn't have to dump so much waste into the ocean. But if you do have, like I said, if you do have a free hour and a half, Plastic Ocean is a really sort of fun documentary to watch. But more sort of moving on to the way we get rid of hazardous waste, there's sort of two ways we sort of detoxify them as a whole. So outside of the biological ways, we typically use physical means, so charcoal or resin to filter out harmful solids. We use distillation to essentially pull water out of solids. To pull the solids out of water to sort of keep them in smaller containers. And we also encapsulate and store deadly waste safely. We also use chemical methods, meaning we convert them to less harmful or harmless chemicals. So you have something like methyl mercury, you could potentially convert it to ethyl mercury to make it safer. So that's the idea here. But the most common way we take care of hazardous waste is actually just land burial. And that is as simple as it sounds, taking waste, burying it underground. And as you can imagine, that is extremely cheap. And it is also extremely, unfortunately, effective way of getting rid of waste, out of sight, out of mind in this case. And there's a couple different ways that we do this, and there's all sorts of ways. It can be just, you bury it under a pile of dirt, in a place. You can also use what are called deep well disposal methods, where you inject waste deep down underground into aquifers or space in the ground that's open. And so that's sort of what we do. And one of the sort of unfortunate things about land burial is that it's out of sight, out of mind. So it doesn't really encourage us to do anything about it. It encourages us to keep producing hazardous waste because it's such an easy way to get rid of it. Just burying it, it's cheap, it's effective, and it's not perfect. So it does leak. So if you do bury something underground, it has the potential to escape from the underground. So if you say put a bunch of mercury down 100 feet, well, if there's a really heavy rainstorm and the ground gets really saturated with water, you potentially have leakage from your storage area. So it's not perfect, but it does work really well. And if you want to sort of get a visual schematic of what I'm talking about here, if we have sort of this, hypothetical town or, area of a town, these deep wells, the idea being is there's these giant pipes that essentially are into the ground, and they inject all this hazardous waste. Again, it could be anything. solvents, mercury, whatever. They inject it down into the ground where it's potentially safe. But I hope you can sort of see by the groundwater moving through the underground here, there's a huge potential for this waste to make it into the groundwater. And unfortunately, once it makes it into the groundwater, it can pretty much make it anywhere. It can make it to the ocean, it can make it into your drinking water, it can make it into lakes, streams, whatever. So it's not a perfect method, but it does serve an overall purpose. But when we're talking about storing hazardous waste, we typically use what are called surface impoundments. So these are essentially just puddles or small ponds, or sometimes even large ponds of water that basically we use to store hazardous chemicals. So you can imagine if you're producing an industrial solvent and you have a bunch of waste from that, well, you can either bury it underground, dump it in the open ocean or something like that, or you put it into a pond that you are using to essentially store your own waste. And these are typically lined, as you can see, but 70% of all surface storage impoundments are unlined, which means that the chemicals can easily get into the soil, and once they make it into the soil, they can make it anywhere. But the idea being is you pump your solvents here in the or whatever hazardous waste you're trying to get rid of, and they essentially settle to the bottom and they become more concentrated and toxic. And so this probably sounds bad to you, and it is. And so there's a lot of risk with storing waste in a surface impoundment like this, including evaporation of toxic chemicals. So getting something like mercury into the air, which then it becomes toxic again, or potentially the risk of overflow during a heavy storm. You can imagine if I have a bunch of deadly chemicals stored in here and I have a big rainstorm come through, well, this could easily overflow and all those deadly chemicals could then make it out into nature. And so that's a really common way we store hazardous waste in a surface impoundment. There's also what are called storage vaults, and these are things are stored in drums, they're buried and monitored. And this is the least commonly used way to store waste for the long term because it's very expensive. It's required. You need a lot of materials to do it, and it takes money to monitor it. But this is the way we store like nuclear waste and stuff like that. And I don't know if you guys have ever heard of any sort of the issues around storing nuclear waste, but it's sort of a really big issue here in the United States and elsewhere because it's really hard to take care of. So, but those are sort of the ways we store our waste. And Massachusetts is not immune to this. We're not a very industrial state anymore, but we still produce lots of waste. We still produce industrial compounds. We used to have nuclear power before they decommissioned the one in Plymouth, but we still have power plants. So we have waste being generated. And this is sort of a map of Massachusetts looking at sort of overall different types of waste storage. And I hope you can sort of see that Massachusetts has a ton of them. And in particular, where I'm assuming the vast majority of us live, since you guys all go to UMass Boston, is that near the Boston area, there are tons and tons of places where we store waste. And there's a mixture of things that are capped or uncapped, very hazardous sites that have a national priority to clean up, or very large quantity hazardous waste generators. So Massachusetts itself is just sort of chock full of potential waste. And even our islands over here, you can see Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard have to have ways to handle your waste because, I think this is pretty intuitive, but wherever humans are, we generate waste. And we have to have ways to take care of that waste. We have to have ways to store that waste. So that's how we handle waste. But the question is, what can we do about our waste? And there are different levels of waste management priority that we need to sort of think about, not only individually, but as a society. And the top one here is simply producing less, trying to make the least amount of waste, trying to use or waste the least amount of stuff. That's the best way to do things. And I think that's sort of an intuitive thing from last class, but that is also true here. And it's going to also be true for the second part of the lecture when we talk about plastic. So that's the key, is producing less. Because remember, this planet has a finite amount of resources. So we have to ultimately use less and produce less. Another sort of priority would be converting it as much as possible into a less hazardous substance. So even if we can't store it long term and it gets out, it causes the least amount of damage. And then whatever else we can't use less of or put into or convert to a less hazardous substance is put into safe long-term storage so it's not leaking. But again, ultimately, we need to find ways to reduce our waste or potentially find new ways to make hazardous materials. And either new ways to make our hazardous materials, so they're either producing less byproducts, or potentially find substitutes for our hazardous materials. So for instance, we don't use mercury to make hats softer anymore. We use different compounds. So we found a substitute for mercury, and that's possible for the vast majority of things we use. It's just about finding the right one and implementing it on an industrial scale. Now, there has been countries that have done this. And so, for instance, Denmark follows this exact policy. And Denmark, as well as, the areas surrounding Denmark and sort of the Nordic countries, they do a really, really good job of sort of minimizing their trash and sort of following these. So for instance, like Denmark, because they're so successful in reusing and recycling stuff, they actually import recyclables from the rest of Europe to sort of keep their production lines going and stuff like that. So it is possible, and it is sort of possible to sort of reduce and use less and find substitutes and stuff like that. So there is ways to sort of handle it. But as I sort of alluded to, solid waste as a whole does contribute to the pollution and over-harvest of reusable resources. So if you sort of remember from when we talked about how nature works, nature is our zero waste, right? The carbon cycle is a completely knit cycle between the atmosphere and living beings and dead things, right? It's a whole linked cycle. So there's zero waste in nature. And so we need to sort of follow that sort of product, trying to essentially turn ourselves into a much more sustainable thing. So the first part of the class, right now we talked about hazardous waste. Now we're going to talk a little bit about what's called solid waste. And solid waste is typically what you think of when you think of waste. So, garbage, right? That's solid waste. And solid waste is stupidly named because something that is a solid waste doesn't actually have to be solid. So solid waste are anything that's discarded or abandoned. It can be solid, liquid, semi-solid, or something in a containerized gaseous material. And this includes, industrial solid waste, things that are produced by mines, farms, industries, sludge from wastewater, so your poop and your pee, raw sewage and debris, and then sort of the most broad class, which is called municipal solid waste. This includes things like garbage, cardboard, food waste, cans, yard waste, e-waste, everything like that. So, and then that being said, the most hazardous waste is solid, but most solid waste isn't hazardous. So your garbage isn't hazardous, your cardboard that you're throwing away isn't hazardous, but all your hazardous waste is solid waste. So hazardous waste is sort of a subsection of this sort of larger category of solid waste. And just as a note, the number one producer of municipal solid waste in the world is the United States, and we're really, really good. So we're the number one in the sort of the total amount of solid waste produced and the total per capita. So what that means is globally, even though we only have 350 million people, we produce more trash than China or India, which have 1.2+ billion people in each of them. So, and in addition, we do this by having each person produce more trash waste than anyone else on the planet. So if you took a pile of my trash from the year, it would be significantly larger than a pile of trash from someone, say, that was living in Denmark or Germany or something like that. So we produce a lot as an individual, and that adds up to being a very lot as a country. And the United States, even though we account for a very small percentage of the world's population, we produce 25% of all solid waste globally, which is a lot. The vast majority of our waste is in the form of industrial solid waste from mining, agriculture, and industry. And then the remaining 1.5% of that is municipal solid waste. So we produce a lot of waste, not only ourselves, but through the things we sort of do. So our food consumption, our energy consumption, our consumption of goods as a whole. And when you start to think about how staggering the amount of waste is, you can make all sorts of crazy, calculations for how much waste the United States puts. But you could essentially fill enough waste to fill garbage trucks to circle the Earth 6 times, right? That's huge, right? You're talking about 12,000 miles, right? That's a huge amount of garbage trucks. Or you can say, my favorite statistic is if you looked at all the K-cups sold in 2013, just in the United States, they could wrap around the globe at 10.5 times. So just K-cups, many of you probably don't even use K-cups, but they're so popular. You could line them up and wrap them around the globe 10.5 times. And there's just so much trash out there, including plastic bottles, which can go to the moon and back 6 times, 100 billion plastic bags, which go to the moon and back 60 times. It's just a staggering amount of waste. when you think about it. It really is. It is a monstrous amount of waste. And we lead the pack easily. So, and so the amount of waste is a problem, and that's pretty self-explanatory. But one of the other problems we have with how we handle waste is our infrastructure. And this is not just true for roads. I know for those of you that drive on New England roads, you know our snow and our ice are not kind to our roads. But that's one type of infrastructure. But the infrastructure to handle trash is equally as outdated. And this leads to places where our trash or our sewage is making it out into the environment. So we don't have enough infrastructure to handle the sheer amount of waste. And this is true not just here in Massachusetts, but this is true here globally. And so in Massachusetts, we have what are called combined sewage outflows, or CSOs. And what these CSOs are done are they're essentially these overflows designed to contain untreated human waste, industrial waste, and sort of other debris from stormwater pipes. And the idea being is that these, and you can see this map of Boston. We have our blue ones that are open. These are our CSOs that are open, and our yellow ones are CSOs that are closed. But what you notice is that these are all sort of lining the Charles River. And the idea being is that Boston's sewer system was originally designed to carry sewage and stormwater in the same exact pipe to a sewage treatment plant. But what ends up happening is we have these outfalls to deal with what happens when we have a large rain event or a very large snow melt. And what ends up happening is if tons and tons of water makes it into our sewage pipes, these overflows essentially leak. And as you can see, all these sewage overflows are right on rivers. So they leak directly into rivers. They leak all this solid waste into rivers. And once it makes it into the rivers, well, it makes it into drinking water. It makes it into the ocean. It makes it into soils. It makes it into sediments. It makes it everywhere. And that's sort of just the reality of Boston. Handling this much waste is very, 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 very difficult. And you can imagine, if this is a problem for Boston that has 1.5-ish million people in our metropolitan area. You can imagine a place like New York, the island of Manhattan, that has 10 million people. It's an even bigger problem. So it is sort of a problem handling the vast volume of waste that we have. A special category of our solid waste is what we call electronic waste, or e-waste. And these are simply discarded electronic devices. This includes cell phones, computers, monitors, TVs, anything that has essentially a battery in it of some sort or is powered by electricity. This is an e-waste. And e-waste is not something we particularly recycle very well. Only about 14% of e-waste is recycled. And the way we typically handle e-waste is not by recycling it in Massachusetts or Kansas or something like that. We typically ship it to somewhere where labor is very cheap, where people don't really care about the conditions their workers are doing. So countries that have very poor labor laws. That's deals with e-waste. It's not a very good way. You can imagine that if you burned your computer or the insides of your computer, that it would produce a lot of noxious chemicals, and you would be right. It's a very sort of dangerous thing to burn. So people that do take care of e-waste often suffer some pretty severe side effects. But again, that's a byproduct of lax labor laws. These things, this wouldn't happen in the European Union or even the United States. So. But countries as a whole, they typically ship things off, but there are many countries that have implemented new laws to essentially minimize the amount of e-waste that is essentially sort of shipped overseas. And so in the EU and Japan, e-waste has to be returned to the manufacturers to either be repaired, remanufactured, or recycled. So they force the manufacturers to handle this. In the United States, this is something that is banned typically from landfills and generators. So we don't burn this here in the United States. And it's not supposed to make it into landfills, even though it does. Because, you can throw an old cell phone into the trash and it easily will make it into one of our landfills, but it's not supposed to be. And then there's also countries that have applied a recycling tax. So you say buy a new cell phone in the EU, and you have to pay a 1% recycling tax. So that tax then goes to the EU, which then they use to recycle your material. because I hope I sort of, hit home the point that recycling e-waste is tough. It's sort of dangerous. So what do we do overall with solid waste? Very much like hazardous waste, we just bury it. And the most common ways we do this, and I'm sure you guys have all seen these, whether it was on TV or in person, is we use what are called sanitary landfills. And the wastes are essentially spread into thin layers, and they're covered by dirt or clay or some sort of plastic foam daily. And the idea being is you just keep burying waste, and it's designed to keep the waste dry, reduce leakage of contaminated sort of materials. It lowers the fire risk, decreases odors, and reduces accessibility to rodents. So it tries to keep the waste contained, but again, we're just burying it. So it doesn't really do anything overall with the waste. And you can see what this looks like. We have a pile of compacted solid waste here, just a bunch of trash buried with dirt or clay or plastic. The green trash trucks driving around Boston or any other areas around Boston. They say they're powered by trash. When they say they're powered by trash, they're powered by the methane that their trash is generating. So using the methane that their trash is generating to power their electricity. And I'll just make a note, the methane that they're getting is from bacteria. So that as the bacteria eat the waste, one of the byproducts is methane. So just as a note. And outside of burying your waste, most commonly in sort of less well-off areas, you have open dumps. And these are essentially fields or pits of garbage. You don't really see these in the United States or the EU, but if you go to more impoverished areas of the world, these are pretty common. They're just, again, there's open pits of garbage. This slide did not translate well to Google Docs. That's okay. The other common way we handle solid waste is by burning them. And so we burn waste in this process of waste energy in incinerators to make steam, to heat spaces, or produce electricity. And the US as a whole, we have about 115 waste to energy incinerators, which produces a decent amount of electricity. But it does incinerate about 9% of all of our municipal waste. But I hope you can see that we're getting rid of the waste, but we're burning it, which means we're producing a lot of carbon dioxide. We're putting all those chemicals into the air. So it's not exactly the most ideal way of things, but they are better in terms relative to landfills. So burning waste is better than sticking it in a landfill. But ultimately, and as we sort of talked about, as opposed to, trying to find and invent new ways to handle waste, the best way to do this is just reduce how much waste we do. So right now, we bury most of our waste. We recycle a very small component, and then we burn some else, and then another part is reducing and reusing it. Ultimately, what we should be doing is the exact opposite. We should really flip this pyramid on its head. We should really be using, reusing, and reducing and recycling way, way more than we are, and burying way, way, way less. So we really need to invert this little pyramid, not a pyramid scheme, but we need to invert the pyramid scheme overall to make things a little bit better. And recycling is sort of an important note here. We recycle here in the United States about 23% of our waste. And that's sort of just like a bulk measurement. And it's a bulk measurement by mass. And recycling in the United States is awful. It really is. And I say it's awful just because it's all for profit. So it's nothing that's really funded by the states or the governments or anything like that. It's something that's for profit. So what will end up happening is companies will oftentimes ship things abroad. So they'll get a bunch of, nice plastic, then they'll ship it over to a different country. And so if you want to sort of read about that sort of process, I would recommend taking a peek at this NPR article about sword recycling and how they rely on China to essentially recycle their waste. But overall, recycling is kind of a problem in the United States because most commonly what ends up happening is we throw our recyclables away. Not just as individuals, but the recycling companies, if they don't like if something is too dirty or they don't want to invest in new technology to clean it, they'll just throw it away. So even though that number on our graph here was 23%, it's actually much lower that ultimately ends up getting recycled, because again, it's all about business, and businesses don't do things the best, to say the least. So. In terms of recycling e-waste, they're typically sold oftentimes illegally to developing countries where typically children process them. So if you want to get really, really sad, go look up, children and e-waste processing on YouTube, or type it into Google or something. If you want to get really sad about what happens to your cell phone or your computer when you throw it away, that's the way to do it. And as you can imagine, if there's child labor, well, that leads to all sorts of nasty exposure to toxic chemicals. If you have children performing labor, you're probably not going to have proper safety, including masks, gloves, ventilation. There's all sorts of things that release lead, copper, and other heavy metals that essentially make things just sort of much more dangerous overall. And just as a note, 82% of children less than 60 in Guia, which is Southeast Asia, suffer from lead poisoning. So it's a really big deal because a lot of children are processing e-waste. So it's a really nasty thing. So overall, when you're getting ready to recycle your e-waste, think before you do it. Think about where it's going to go so it doesn't end up doing something really terrible. So. That being said, you can imagine with all the trash we're being produced, electronic and otherwise, there is a huge economic opportunity to handle waste. And so you as a person can potentially save a lot of money by reusing your own materials. So say, you have a table, well, potentially repurposing that table into something else. Or potentially, taking someone else's secondhand things like at yard sales or Craigslist or thrift stores or something like that, to essentially take something that was going to be thrown away and repurposing it for something you're going to do. And this includes also, upcycling and reusing reclaimed wood from, say, a house that's falling down. Because you can imagine if this house or this table were no longer of use, they would just be thrown into the dump, right? They would just rot in the dump. So there's a potential opportunity to reuse these things, not in your own life, but there's also lots of businesses that are being started trying to essentially reuse all these different items, to repurpose old things, to reuse our waste as a whole. And this has led people to propose this idea of an industrial ecosystem, copying nature. And as I hope I've convinced you, sustainable society needs to do what nature does. We're going to do this process called biomimicry, or we should be doing this process called biomimicry, where we're copying what nature does, year zero waste, right? Think about that carbon cycle. No waste. Everything is recycled over and over again. And this idea, it comes right off this idea of the food web, right? Everything is connected in some way. There's a cycling of nutrients. There's a cycling of energy here. This is something we should try to look to incorporate. And what this looks like is very simple, like food web design. The idea being is if you have a society, you can have an electric power plant because everyone needs power. And this power plant can be, could be doing, coal or oil or natural gas or something like that. But it has a lot of byproducts that it produces, such as calcium, heat, ash, heat, right? Waste, right? So there's lots of waste that it does. Well, in sort of a more natural ecosystem, you would imagine instead of getting rid of that waste, right? And so instead of burying that calcium or just letting that waste heat go somewhere else, or letting the ash or burying the ash, well, maybe you can send that to another place. So maybe you can send it to a fish farm to heat their fish tanks, or you send it to a pharmaceutical plant to heat their buildings, or you send it to greenhouses to heat their buildings, right? So you can imagine you can send all these waste products elsewhere to be reused. So nothing is really going to waste, very, very much like nature is doing. And these create sort of an economic incentive. And so I always like to talk about the economics about this sort of idea of sustainability and biodiversity and stuff like that, because it's sort of a critique of it, right? Well, you can't make money for it. It's going to cost too much money. And that's just not true. It wasn't true for sustaining ecosystems. It's certainly not true for handling waste. And so the idea being is if you can make these industrial ecosystems, they can create economic benefits for businesses by reducing costs, by reducing penalties, by reducing the need to dispose of waste. It creates all these nice opportunities. And so this is, again, I just want to sort of highlight this in a much more New England sense. So in Burlington, Vermont, there's a Intervale Eco Park that was built, I believe, there, they have all these other outputs, you know, straw and stuff like that is then sent, you know, into other parts, and then other waste parts are sent to another part. So you have this sort of interconnected sort of mixture of things where nothing really goes to waste. It is a green ecosystem. And just to sort of show you one more, we have, I'm not going to try to pronounce the name of this city in Denmark, but they do have an industrial ecosystem as well. That's, again, all around a power plant where they send all their waste energy, all of their waste products to someplace else. So there is no net waste. And the idea being is if you could just emulate this system, well, you produce less solid waste, you produce less hazardous waste, you reduce the need to dump things, you reduce the need to bury things, you reduce the need for people to be exposed to toxic chemicals. And so this is certainly the future of things, whether or not people want to adopt it now or in the future. But again, Earth has a finite amount of resources. We have a finite amount of space. We have to sort of move toward this more sustainable thing, not just for sort of our own use of things, but also for nature, right? We need to protect our biodiversity. We need all the good things that biodiversity provides us. And by reducing the amount of waste we put, we can also limit the amount of biodiversity that we harm. So that's waste. That's sort of all the sort of things I want to talk about with waste, how we handle waste, why waste is bad, the side effects of waste, things like that. We're going to switch gears and continue to talk about waste, but we're going to talk about a very specific type of waste. And that specific type of waste is plastic waste. And what happens to plastic waste once it makes it out into the environment? And so there's a quote from the CEO of Nestle, which is, how do I say this nicely? Potentially one of the most evil companies on the planet. And if you want to know why I say that, I'd recommend looking up what Nestle has been doing to water supplies across the planet. But the CEO in 2019, John Catarano, said, "The water bottle has in some ways become the mink coat or the pack of cigarettes. It is socially not very acceptable to the young folks, and that scares me." And it should scare him. It really should. And the idea being is that the plastic bottle to younger generations is becoming essentially taboo. We're recognizing the dangers of using plastics as sort of younger generations. And that's something that scares someone like Nestle, a company like Nestle, because they rely so heavily on plastics. So this is the backdrop. You have lots and lots of production of plastic by very, very large companies, Nestle, Coke, so on and so forth. And we know there's lots of bad things that are associated with plastic. So let's talk about plastics. Let's talk about what happens when plastics make it out into the environment. What happens when plastics become deadly? Let's talk about ways we can handle plastic. So when I talk about plastic, I'd like to talk about it through the lens of marine biology. And I do this because A, I like the ocean, but B, because this is the best studied ecosystem that has been affected by plastic. Remember, the planet is covered in about 70% ocean. So if anything's going to affect, if trash or plastics is going to affect anywhere, it's likely to affect the ocean relative to other places. So the ocean is very heavily studied in terms of thinking about the effects of plastic on nature. That being said, plastics affects everything. So plastics affects soil, it affects rivers, it affects you, it affects animals, it affects everything. It's not just the ocean, but we're going to think about this in the lens of what people call the plastic ocean. The awfulest one because it's stuck directly in his nose, but something as simple as a sea turtle with a plastic straw stuck in its nose, plastic wrapped around a salmon, essentially strangling the salmon, or something as sort of terrifying as a seal trapped in discarded fishing gear. And it affects all sorts of things across the planet. And it can be as horrifying as a seal with a plastic bag around its face because it thought it was eating a jellyfish, or looking at the stomach contents of a whale. And we're seeing a whale that has 2 flip-flops, 115 drinking cups, 25 plastic bags, 4 plastic bottles. So seeing a huge amount of plastic inside the stomach of a single whale. Just imagine if you tried to eat 115 drinking cups, let alone eating flip-flops in plastic bags. But just think about if you just ate the drinking cups, right? You would die, right? And that's the same thing that's happening for the whale. And when you sort of see what that looks like on the inside of a whale, that's what it looks like. This is what plastic looks like inside of an animal. It doesn't decompose. You can see that. You can see the lid of the plastic cups, right? It's not something that these animals can break down once it gets inside them. So it gets in there and stays in there. So let's talk about the numbers first, because I think it's important to think how big of a problem this is. And so, and it's a big problem because it's everywhere, right? Think of anything in your life, anything, your phone, your household items, your couch, your car. Everything is touched by plastics. Everything has plastics in it. Plastics are one of the top building materials on the planet. So everything in your life touches plastic in one shape or form. With that being said, approximately 300 million tons of plastics are created annually. That's a lot of tons of plastic. A lot. Of that plastics, about 50% is single use. And what do I mean by single use? I mean, you use it once and you throw it away. So a grocery shopping bag, a bottle of water, right? That's single use. You use it once and you throw it away. That's a lot. And of that 300 million that's produced, about 10 to 20 million, so about 10% is actually enters the oceans annually. This usually goes up every year, so it's getting more and more every year, but a substantial proportion does enter the ocean. Of the plastic that has entered the ocean, 80% of it wasn't like dumped off the side of the boat. 80% of it entered from some sort of land-based source. So it got into a river, got into a stream, got into our waste pipes, and flowed right directly into the ocean. And so when we sort of look at the numbers again, about 1.15 to 2.4 million tons of plastic enter our oceans via rivers annually, and the most of it comes between May and October. So, when it's nice and warm in the northern hemisphere. The vast majority of our population lives in the northern hemisphere. So when we're most active, when we're using things a lot during between May and October, that's when we put the most plastics in the ocean. And then the top 20 rivers, most of which are in Asia, contribute 67% of all plastics to the ocean. And the top contributor here is actually the Yangtze River in China. And so we can look at our rivers. So we have all these different rivers across mostly Asia, but also in Africa as well. And you can see the river, the country of origin, or the country where it discharges into the ocean, and the amount of plastics that's making it in there every year. And you'll notice is that the vast majority of river plastics are either in Asia, principally Southeast Asia, but there's also a decent amount of rivers, including the Amazon, or the Imo River in South America and Africa, that are dumping a lot of rivers. I think the only good part about this graph is the Mississippi River is not on this table, which makes me feel better as a whole. But it's still clearly a huge problem here. And we can look at the sort of the plastic pollution problem in terms of countries. And so this is the y-axis is mismanaged plastic metric tons per year. And these are all the top 20 polluting countries. And you can see China leads the way by a huge amount. And then many, many other countries in Southeast Asia have a lot of waste in terms of plastic pollution. And you have some other countries in Africa as well, and some Asian countries as well. And then the United States sort of rounds up the bottom 20. So we produce a lot of waste as a whole, but we are not the top plastic polluting country in the world, which again makes me feel a little bit better, but not that great because there's still lots of countries producing a lot of plastic overall. So again, as I mentioned, rivers are the primary way things make it into the ocean. That's 80% of all plastics that has made it into the ocean come via rivers. But there are other ways that plastics and a subsection of plastics, which are called microplastics, which we'll talk about in a second, make it into the ocean. And this include agricultural runoff, so from our fields and our livestock, aquaculture, so we're growing or we're growing fish and shrimp and stuff like that in tanks, cruise ships, dumping of ocean, stormwater runoff, shipping and fishing industries dumping or leaving their nets in the water, direct runoff from urban areas, and poor waste management. So there are lots of ways that plastics make it into the ocean, but remember, the vast majority of plastics make it via rivers. And sort of one of the things I mentioned is cruise ships. Cruise ships are not a huge source, but they are a decent sized source of plastics and other pollutions, waste items to the ocean. And one of the companies that has been in the hot seat about this for many, many years now is actually Carnival, the Carnival Corporation, so Carnival Cruise Lines. And so back a couple years ago, they were fined $20 million after they pled guilty to releasing food and plastic waste directly into the ocean. And just to put that in perspective, that $20 million fine was 0.1%, so 0.1% of the $18 billion that they brought in 2018. So they're being fined, which is good, which means they're forced to accept accountability, but it's not a major fine. This would be like, me getting fined $100 for throwing a piece of trash out the window. It's not a huge fine. It's not going to dissuade me from throwing trash out the window if I so want to throw trash out the window. But more importantly, you can imagine that maybe that $20 million fine is less than it costs them to process their trash every year. So clearly not enough of a punishment for our friends at Carnival, and as well as other cruise lines as well. So what makes up our top plastic contributors? And the most common is single-use plastic. Again, these are things like caps and lids, bottles, trash bags, wrappers, things you use once and then you throw away. It's not like, your phone if it has plastic on it, or it's not like a cutting board, right? It's stuff you use once and it goes right into the recycling bin or it goes right into the trash. And so by far the most common single-use plastic around is cigarette butts. And that is a massive amount. And you might not think, well, cigarette butts have plastic in them. They do. They have a lot of plastic in them. They're about 20% plastic. And because so many people smoke across the planet and they just throw their cigarettes away, they are by far the most common single-use plastic item in nature. This is followed up by caps and lids and bottles, plastic bags, food wrappers, cups, plates. Okay, cups, plates, beverages, and paper bags. And these top 10 make up about 80% of all plastic waste around the globe. And so that's just sort of really common things, right? I'm sure you guys, many of you probably haven't smoked since you're young, and it's not really a thing most young people do, but I'm sure you guys have all drank out of a plastic bottle. You've gone to Dunkin' Donuts and got a nice plastic cup for your iced coffee. You've gone to the grocery store and you got a plastic bag, or you've eaten a candy bar, right? And you have that plastic wrapper. Everyone does these things because they're so pervasive in society. And they're so pervasive in society because they're so cheap to make. Petroleum is super duper cheap right now, which means that making things out of plastic is super duper cheap. But the problem here is what happens to this plastic over time? And plastic is, as a whole, synthetic, meaning it's man-made. And synthetic is a word that is used as the negative a lot, but it's not necessarily a negative thing. There's lots of good synthetic things out there, but in the case of plastic is synthetic, and it's a bad thing. And so when plastic, because it's synthetic and it's sort of a tough compound, you guys know that, like your car bumper is made out of plastic, but you can hit that thing with a sledgehammer and it will stay intact, right? So plastic is tough. So when plastic does make it to the nature, it takes a really, 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 really long time to break down. And the idea being here is that there is varying levels of time that it takes these things to break down. So if you go to the grocery store and you buy a nice bottle of water because you're thirsty, and you drink that bottle of water and you threw it in the trash and it made it into the ocean, well, that plastic bottle that you consumed in, say, 20 minutes will sit around in the ocean for 450 years. If you like to eat fish, the lines and the buoys and stuff like that, they leave out in nature to catch your fish will hang around in the environment for 600 years or 80 years. So, or if you have a child, your disposable diapers will hang around for 450 years. So these things hang around for a very, 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 very long time, which is unfortunate. It's clearly longer than a human lifetime. But the important thing to remember with plastics is they hang around for a long time, and plastics do not decompose. So when we talked about decomposition, right, we took carbon-based material and we recycled it back into the ecosystem. Plastic doesn't do that. Plastic does not decompose. Plastics, they break down, but they don't decompose. So once you put plastic in nature, it will never, ever, ever go away. It will always be there. But what it does is it breaks down into what are called microplastics, or plastics that are less than 5 millimeters in size. And the way these plastics break down is primarily through photodegradation. So the sun basically beating down on plastic will cause it to break down over time. The other common way we see things is wind and waves. So just the action of the wind and the action of the waves pressing on the plastic will cause it to break down. But again, it's breaking down, not decomposing. And because the plastic is always there, there's estimated to be about 15 trillion tons of plastic particles floating in the ocean, just in the ocean alone. So think about that, 15 trillion tons of plastic. And we've only been using plastic for about 70 years now. So just think about how much more tons of plastic are going to make it there. And if you think about that time period, right, if we've only been using it for 50 years, that means many of those plastics haven't broken down. They're still in big chunks out there. So again, plastics, they are, if you have a bottle of water, it's broken down by the sun, the wind, and the waves into microplastics, which again are less than 5 millimeters in size. And you can see a picture here of a copepod, which is a microscopic organism ingesting these plastics here in green. Or you can cut open a rainbow runner, and you can see it's ingested smaller bits of plastic here because it thought those plastics were some sort of tasty food. So that's microplastics, the breaking down of bigger things. But we also have what are called virgin plastics, or plastics that have never been made into a material such as a bottle. And these are essentially what we call microbeads. And so these are a very specific type of microplastic that are used to make larger plastic things. And so, these are used to make, exfoliants, toothpastes, things in your sort of makeup. And so we use all sorts of these microplastics, these virgin microbeads, in our everyday products. And these microplastics, again, directly make it out into the ocean as well. There is in 2015, the Obama administration did sign the Anti-Microbead Act, which is designed to limit some of these things, but they still are found in many toothpastes and stuff like that. And then finally, we have what are called microscopic fibers or microfibers. And these are in your clothing and textiles that are made up of either nylon, polyester, or polypropylene. And these directly enter the environment through washing them. So as you wear a t-shirt that has any one of these compounds in it, the plastics break off, they wash into your drain. And once they make it to the drain, they eventually drain into the ocean. So these are all the sources, either microplastics from breaking down of big things, microbeads, or microfibers. So this is how all these plastics are making it into the ocean. And the next question I hope you ask yourself is, where are these plastics in the marine environment? I'm sure you guys have heard of the Great Trash Island in the Pacific Ocean. That's certainly a thing, but plastics are found everywhere. Everywhere. There's no place on the planet that does not have plastic. But plastics are heavily concentrated in near-shore environments. So as you can imagine, if most of the plastics are making them into the ocean via rivers, well, because rivers drain into coastal waters, there's going to be a lot of plastic in coastal waters. But plastics are found everywhere. They're found in all sorts of marine zones. They're carried across the globe via ocean currents. The winds and the currents mix them in, so they get down pretty deep as well. And there's all sorts of ways these move around. And just to put this in perspective of how pervasive plastics are, when I said plastics are everywhere, they are everywhere. So a recent study, and if you want to take a peek at it, here's an article I linked for the BBC. They did a dive down to the Mariana Trench. So those of you that have never heard of the Mariana Trench before, it is the deepest part of our ocean. It goes down about 11 kilometers, so it's super duper deep. And when they went down there, they found plastic. 11 kilometers below the surface of the ocean, and there's plastic. And remember, that plastic is never going to go away. It's always going to be there. It's not going to go away. It's going to stay around for hundreds of years. And then when you can't see it anymore, it's going to be there in the form of microplastics. So plastics are everywhere. They're concentrated on the coast, but they are area. everywhere. Now, the question we should ask is, why do we give a crap about plastics, right? Why? If I brush my teeth with them, if I put them in my makeup, if I'm consuming them, why do I care? Well, there is some pretty severe side effects. And I hope the sort of the early pictures I showed you in this lecture about sort of animals being choked to death and their stomachs being filled with plastics was enough to convince you that plastics are a problem. But there is lots of other issues associated with plastic. And so one of them is what we call persistent organic compounds, or POPs. And what these do is they adhere or stick to plastics. And these POPs, they consist of PCBs, which I'm sure you guys have heard of. They're, I'm drawing a blank on what PCB stands for, sorry. But they, in addition with heavy metals, will actually bind and stick to plastics. So these are toxic chemicals like mercury that will stick to plastics. Other things like BPA. So I'm sure you guys have all heard the sort of the BPA craze a couple years ago, where companies were struggling. They were using BPA to make their plastic bottles, and there's this sort of huge push to get BPAs out of plastics, because one of the things BPAs do is they actually mimic estrogen. So for those of you that remember our talk about hormones, estrogen is a type of hormone, which is a signaling molecule. And if you can mimic a hormone, you can basically make your body do anything. So it's a really bad thing. BPA is also cancer causing. And one of the things that these do, in addition to PCBs and heavy metals, they stick to plastics, and they also help break down plastics as well. Other types of pharmaceuticals, so caffeine, acetaminophen, estrogen will also bind to plastics. Pesticides bind to plastics, and flame retardants bind to plastics. And so I hope this list of terrible things tells you that if these things can bind to plastic and they can make it into fish, if they can make it into shrimp, they can make it into shellfish, they can also make it into you. And that is 100% true. And we'll talk about that in a brief moment. But just to know, there are direct effects on the organisms that are eating these. Maybe it's not just because it's filling the stomach of a whale, but maybe it's making the whales sick. Maybe it's giving the whales cancer. Maybe it's giving the whales tumors or ulcers, right? There's all negative side effects to all these things that bind to plastic and things are eating them. And there's a huge list of negative side effects from marine organisms that consume plastics. And there's a reduction of food consumption by many species. And so this includes not just natural species, but also shellfish and fish that we farm so they're commercially viable. You can imagine if you are reducing the amount of food you eat, that means you're getting smaller fish, which means your fishery is going to suffer over time. So there is an economic issue here as well. It can reduce the amount of offspring that fish will produce. It can cause physical and internal damage to organisms, so including perforating bowels, inflammation, all sorts of negative side effects. It can reduce the growth of many species. And then one of the other things that really sort of hits home for humans in terms of how these bad things make it into us is this idea of biomagnification. And the idea being, what is biomagnification or bioaccumulation? And the idea being is if you have some sort of deadly toxin, so say you have a PCB, right, a cancer-causing thing, it makes it out into the ocean, it attaches to plastic, or it's just hanging out in the ocean. Well, our phytoplankton, so our microscopic organisms, they will absorb this toxic compound. Now, they absorb this toxic compound. It doesn't really affect them all that much, but because they're only absorbing a very small amount. Now, those microscopic plankton are eaten by bigger things, which have to eat a lot of small things to survive. And then those bigger things are eaten by even bigger things, which need to eat a lot of the things below it, and so on and so forth up the food chain. So the idea being is as this energy flows through the system, right, energy being food, it's also bringing along with it toxic compounds. And so because a herring has to eat a lot of zooplankton to survive, it means it also eats a lot of PCBs. Again, indirectly, just by consuming the food. It's not taking them from the water, it's getting them from its food. And because the salmon needs to eat more than the herring, and the whale and I want to eat salmon, well, if there's lots of PCBs in the salmon, and I eat the salmon, and I eat salmon again and again and again, well, I'm going to be exposed to a lot of these PCBs, which means there could be potential deleterious side effects on myself. And so for those of you that were around in the 90s and the early 2000s, or you were paying attention in those times, I should say, you'll know there was this huge push about mercury in tuna fish. And that mercury in the tuna fish got there because of bioaccumulation or biomagnification. So that's sort of one of the ways it gets to us. But what are the direct effects on human health? And this is really it's kind of unknown at this point. We're at the end of the marine food web, so it's sort of, we have to eat a lot of fish to sort of experience some of these side effects. But overall, right now, it's sort of in limbo. There's lots of things that are hypothesized to occur because we eat these microplastics, because we're absorbing these POPs and stuff like that. But it's not really well understood. We're sort of in the infancy of understanding the direct effects of plastics on human biology. But we do know that our POPs, there's a special class of them called phthalates or plasticizers, and these make plastics more flexible and durable. One of the things about these phthalates is that they are endocrine disruptors, so they disrupt our normal hormone flow. And as I mentioned, hormones basically tell your body what to do. They're long-term communicators, but we know that phthalates are associated with affecting on human growth, metabolism, reproduction. So for instance, phthalates impacts male fertility. So it makes male semen quality less. There's much more damage to DNA. There's decreased sperm motility and decreased semen volume. So there is direct effects on human reproduction. There has been some linkages between these plasticizers and early developmental disorders, including ADHD and potentially autism. And does seem to be some sort of relationship between diabetes, insulin resistance, breast cancer, and obesity, and exposure to these plasticizers. So there is lots of anecdotal evidence right now. I'm sure within the next 5 to 10 years, we're going to see hundreds, if not thousands, of studies linking all these negative side effects to all these negative things in plastic to human issues. Now, you might think, I don't eat fish, so I don't need to worry about these. Well, you're wrong. The most common way humans get microplastics and all these hormone mimicking compounds and all these nasty things that are associated with plastic is actually by drinking plastic bottles. And so a study from a couple of years ago found that 93% of all bottled water sold had microplastics in it, and it had compounds in it that were potentially harmful. So some of these sort of compounds that I spoke about here. So 93% of all plastic bottled water. That's not including things like sodas, seltzers. This is just straight bottled water. And what you'll notice is that all the big brands of water, whether it's the horrible people at Nestle or Aquafina or Dasani or whatever, they all have microplastics in them, and they have varying levels of concentrations. But the idea being is they do vary. So Nestle Pure Life water has really high concentrations, where something like Evian has much lower concentrations. But ultimately, the average number of plastic particles for every liter of water sold was 325. So if you go to the store, you buy a bottle of Coke, you're going to be likely consuming a few hundred plastic particles every time you do it. And again, it's not because you're eating the plastic. It's just the plastic breaks down over time. So the longer a plastic bottle is sitting, the more plastics are going to leach directly from the bottle into your physical what you're drinking. So remember, plastic doesn't decompose. It breaks down by wind, light, and water. So all these things make plastics come into your water bottle, even though you weren't really intending them to be there. So, and so overall, think about that when you're gonna buy water, right? When you're going to buy soda, when you're going to buy anything with plastic that you're going to drink and ingest, right? There's the potential for you to ingest microplastics. In addition, there's also the potential if you buy stuff at the store. So say I went to the store and I bought a package of corn, right? And that corn is in a styrofoam container, it's wrapped in plastic. Well, the longer that sits out, that's exposed to light from the store, well, the more likely that microplastics are to leach from the plastic directly into my corn. And then I will then consume that microplastics in my corn. So think about this idea. No matter what you get that's wrapped in plastic, that's contained in plastic, you're probably going to get plastics, microplastics in the things you consume. And so for those of you that were paying attention last year, I'm sure you guys all saw the huge stink out there that Starbucks, Disney, Tom Brady, and all the people were shunning plastic straws, how they were bad for turtles and sea life, and that was all great. It sort of gave issue at the global stage to the problem of plastics. But the problem is straw waste accounts for 0.03% of the total plastic waste by mass. And it's sort of an unfortunate thing. So it's a very small amount. And this all started because a 9-year-old girl's term paper actually falsely reported. So she accidentally reported that 500 million straws were consumed daily. But this actual number is much lower. And plastic from straws is not as big a deal as sort of news outlets picked it up to be, but it's still plastic. If it makes it into nature, it's still bad. So it's a good thing to try to limit the amount of plastic straws used. But the other thing is that straws are actually seen as a gateway plastic, sort of a funny thing to think of, but people see them as a gateway plastic because they typically see it as a catalyst for other single-use plastics. So if you use straws, you're also likely to use very many other types of plastics, so like bottles and things like that. They also potentially see it as a catalyst to potentially get rid of other single-use plastic things. So, maybe after straws, now we're going to tackle plastic bags. And maybe after plastic bags, we'll tackle bottles, right? So it might be a gateway to getting rid of other really important things, even though plastic straws themselves aren't that big a deal. And so because this is a problem, and I hope I've convinced you that this is a problem for health, for the environment, for sustainability, there's been all sorts of businesses that have popped up to potentially clean our oceans, to clean things. And so one of these was Ocean Cleanup, and they're trying to clean up the ocean. And so there's all sorts of companies that are surrounding this. And they do a pretty decent job about cleaning up all sorts of plastic waste. And this was actually developed by an 18-year-old Danish inventor. And he's trying to reduce sort of overall global things. And it's a nonprofit, but you can imagine you could do this for profit, right? You can imagine I could clean up this plastic waste, use that plastic waste to then make other products of plastic, and I'm getting my raw materials for a very cheap price, right? Because plastic waste is free. And if you want to sort of see what that looks like, here's a really fun YouTube video to see how his process of ocean cleanup is working. It's actually pretty fun to sort of take a peek at if you have a couple minutes. Other people have developed other ways to turn plastic from the ocean into marketable goods. So this company, 4Ocean, makes bracelets out of recycled ocean plastic and fish and netting. And so the co-founder, Andrew Cooper, said, as a for-profit business, we're able to give ocean trash a monetary value and incentivize people all over the world to change their behavior. That's how we clean the ocean and drive the actions and policies that will prevent trash from entering in the first place. So if you can put a monetary value on things, you might be able to clean things up. And I hope you sort of remember from last class that nature has a monetary value. And there is a monetary value to saving nature. And there's also a monetary value that you can get from not only the raw goods of plastic, but also from sort of reusing those plastics as a whole. So the sort of the way we'll end this is talking about what you can do, and it's really it's hard, and I fully admit that it's a hard thing to do. Plastics are so freaking pervasive. When you go to get a drink of water, try to use a reusable water bottle. Or you could be like one of my students in the past, get a single-use water bottle and use it for 3 years. And I actually mean that. I had a student that had a bottle, a single-use plastic bottle he was using for 3 years. I had him throw it away because he's been using this plastic bottle for 3 years, so he's been ingesting all these microplastics. But if you're going to use a single-use plastic, reuse it for as long as you can. So try to limit the amount of single use you can do. Use recyclable bags. Use a reusable water bottle. Use clothing that is not made with plastics, and try to essentially recycle as much as you physically can. So the extra credit assignment that you have is to do a waste audit and see how much of your waste you're recycling, what types of waste you're producing, getting you to think about what sorts of waste you're using, because this starts by you becoming, if you care about any of this and you want to make change, this starts with you becoming cognizant of what you're doing and trying to change the behaviors around you, and then eventually changing the behaviors at the societal level. That's sort of how that workflow goes. So, but it does start with you just sort of thinking it. And so again, trying to limit the amount of single-use plastics you use. And so, and you can make a big difference. So like, for instance, my wife and I, we recycle about 90% of all of our waste that we use, and we don't use any single-use plastics, and we try to sort of be as environmentally friendly as we can, but mostly because we're just cognizant of the fact that we're producing a lot of trash and that we should try to recycle as much as we can and try to reuse as much as we physically can. And just sort of as a last note about this, there's sort of new research coming out about using organisms to degrade plastics. So there are some microbes out there, and if you want to take a peek of it, there's this group called the Tara Ocean Expeditions. They have this nice article I recommend you taking a peek at. They are looking at microbes that have the natural ability to break down plastic. And so microbes in the ocean naturally colonize plastics in what are called biofilms. And biofilms, if you've ever forgot to brush your teeth before you went to bed and you woke up and your teeth were all grimy and gross, that's a biofilm on your teeth. It's just bacteria growing in a layer on top of a surface. So in the ocean, bacteria naturally grow as biofilms on plastics. And when they're growing as biofilms on plastics, what they do is they take the carbon in plastics, they break it down, and they actually assimilate it into their own biomass, and they use it to make ATP. So there is microbes out there that we could potentially use to degrade plastics. Because remember, plastics break down. They don't decompose. But there are microbes out there that we could potentially use to degrade our plastics for us. There's also some interesting new insects that have been shown to eat plastics and break them down as well. But I think the best case right now is probably using the power of the microbe to break down plastics. But again, this is not a solution for right now. This is a solution for down the line. And the idea being is reusing and reducing your plastic is going to be the best way. And with that, that's going to be the end of our class. If you guys have any questions about what we talked about today, if you have any questions about your paper, because remember it is due coming up. If it's today, if I'm not mistaken. But if you have any questions, play that. If you have any questions about that, please let me know. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a good day, and tomorrow I will see you when we talk about the scientific method. So I have a question in the chat that's asking me, how do we do the extra credit assignment? So the idea being, let me pop this open. The extra credit assignment is available on Blackboard. So if you go to the far left side of Blackboard, it says extra credit assignment. And the extra credit assignment is your personal waste audit. And so for 3 straight days, you're going to monitor what you generate for plastic waste, whether you're at home, work, or on the go. And the idea being is you're going to use the table below to essentially record what you're doing. So for instance, say I'm at home and I'm getting ready to throw away a bottle of milk. Well, I take that bottle of milk and say I put it into the recycling bin. I just mark that I put that in the recycling bin. Then I produce some metal, and I say, oh, let's pretend I throw that metal in the trash. And then I produce a plastic bag, and pretend I throw the plastic bag in the trash. And I do that for 3 days in a row. And then eventually I'm going to get a number here. So I can pretend that I recycled 100 things of plastic and 12 metal things and 5 trash bags, right? And what I can do is say, okay, if I recycled, total amount, I have, and actually one other thing is that other categories, like say you threw it outside, you just threw it on the ground, or escaped your car, right? Pretend you're driving and a plastic bag escaped your car, that happens. So that's what that is. And so the idea being is if I say, let me do easy math here for myself. So what we want to do is calculate the percentage recycled here. Now the idea being is I have 100 total plastic items and I recycled 95 of them. So that means I have 95 recycled divided by 100, which gives me 95%. And I would do that for all these different categories to figure out how much I recycle. Again, I want you to be honest here. I don't want you to, think I'm going to discount, give you a bad grade for not, recycling or anything like that. I just want you to become more aware of sort of what you are physically doing. So that's the idea. I want you to take a peek at what you're doing, calculate how much you're recycling, see where you can improve, and then as you sort of scroll down, you want to answer some questions. How can you get better? How do you think you compare to the global average? What's the largest category of waste? And you just want to answer these questions. What could you do to make yourself better? How could you explain? How would you explain to your grandparent or a child or your parent? How could you make this better? Does that make sense? That's the idea. Just getting you to think a little bit more about your trash. Really, really simple, but a very powerful exercise. Because I feel like people that don't think about these things, they don't change. But if you think about this, well, maybe if you see that you use 95 plastic bottles in 3 days, or even 20 plastic bottles in 3 days, maybe you go, well, maybe that's too much. Maybe even then you could think, well, I'm probably spending too much money on plastic bottles. So maybe you want to dial back how much plastic bottle you're using because it will save you money, and it's also better for the environment overall. So that's the goal here. Get you to think about, how you're probably not that good at handling trash, because most people aren't, and it's not really it's not really a societal thing to sort of shame one another for trash. It should be, but it's not. So you might not even think what you're doing is a big deal. You might think you're good at it, but you realize you're not so good at it. And if you wanted to sort of be extra extra into it, you could weigh all your trash and see how much trash you physically produce on a given day, like the total biomass, or I'm sorry, the total mass of trash, but you don't have to do that. So that's the goal here. Does anybody have any more questions? Okay, well, no one has any more questions. I will see you guys tomorrow.
Your son is